Welcome to Research Talk. One question that I have always been asked when it comes to phenomenology is how many participants are good enough in a phenomenological study? And the answer to this question is it depends. It depends on many variables, and we'll discuss those in today's video. So we are going to talk about how many participants are good enough in a phenomenological study. I have went through a number of phenomenological study and tried to answer this question. And what I have found that a typical number that I have seen in a phenomenological study is somewhere between 8 to 15 participants. And these participants vary. You see, like in some studies, there are 8 participants, some studies 10, 12, 15. But more or less, the number varies between 8 to 15 participants in various phenomenological traditions. So when you decide the number of participants, it depends on a key variable, which is the complexity of the phenomenon. So let's say if you are doing a study where you are collecting, obviously you are spending time in collecting data, and let's say you are spending a lot of time where you are using different means of collecting data. So let's say if I'm doing interviews, I'm also doing participant observation. I'm also doing participants' reflections, writing reflections. And let's say I'm also doing document analysis as well. So you see, in this study, it seems complex because the phenomenon that I'm exploring, I'm spending a lot of time and using different ways of collecting data. Now, since I'm using all these different means of collecting data, I'm spending a lot of time in this whole process. The number of participants in this case will be less. And as I said, that I'm spending different sources of collecting the data. So if you are doing a phenomenological study where you are using, based on the phenomenon that you are exploring, if you are using various means of collecting data, in that case, the number of participants will be on the lower side, so maybe around 7, 8, 9 participants. However, if I'm doing a study where, let's say, I'm only doing interviews, let's say I'm doing like interviews which last around 45 minutes to 1 hour, in this case, my number of participants will be more because I'm using only one means of, so this study seems less complex as compared to a study where I'm using all these different means of phenomenological materials. I did one study where a couple of years ago, where I wanted to understand the phenomenon of lived experiences of empathy and compassion in therapy by counselors, mental health counselors. So I was interviewing mental health counselors and try to understand, explore their lived experiences of empathy and compassion in therapy. And I was only using interviews as part of my data collection process. And I remember I did, I think, around 13 participants for my study. So you see, the number of participants tends to be more on this side. When you are having maybe one means of data collection, the study is a little less complex. But if I'm doing a study where I'm collecting all these different sources of data, when I'm collecting those experiences, phenomenological materials, in that case, if the phenomenon is more complex, you may end up on the lower side. So in general, the number of participants varies between 8 to 15. And it obviously depends on the complexity, resources, and some other variables that determine your final number. Another thing I would advise, in the beginning of a phenomenon, you may not be sure about what should be your final number of participants, because you are still in the beginning phase of your study. Maybe you are talking to your first participant. And then based on your first participant's interaction, interviews, then you may decide that, okay, I need to do something else. I need to maybe collect some more different sources of data. So you can tweak your study and your number of participants may go up or down based on your initial engagement with the research process. So when it comes to phenomenology, I would say maintain an openness, start the data collection process. Yes, for IRB purposes, you need to mention, so you can mention something like this. And IRB people also understand that phenomenology as a research design maintains an openness towards the phenomenon, and because of this openness, the final numbers may change. So you can use that when you apply for your IRB approval, but I think the final numbers in terms of total number of participants is determined by the complexity, but also your own engagement in the research process. You may have already heard about a statement I might have used already. A phenomenon calls itself how it should be studied. This statement, I think, is from Max Manen, if I'm right. So a phenomenon calls itself how it should be studied. What it means is you cannot predict and determine everything in advance as you start your process, your research process. So the phenomenon, as you engage yourself, as you dwell with the phenomenon itself will tell you how it should be studied, how many participants are going to be good for your study. So trust the process, and then your final number of participants you'll yourself feel that you are reaching a point of saturation, and these number of participants are good for my study. So point of saturation, as you engage in the process, you will come to know. But in general, the participants vary from 8 to 15, 16 participants in phenomenology. I hope this clarification, this discussion has answered the question of how many participants are good in a phenomenological study. Thank you very much, and I'll see you again.